Do. Well, hello. I am Layman Kingsford, and this is Game Speak, episode 12. Today, I am going to talk about role playing games. Uh, Tabletop role playing games, not video game role playing games. I have been a lover of role playing games since like when I was in the fourth grade. So that's decades, folks, decades. My dad went on a business trip. I was reading Lord of the Rings at the time. I think I've said this before on one of these other broadcasts. But he was on a business trip, and I was reading Lord of the Rings at the time, like in fourth grade, and he was at Purdue University, and he saw this box that had dragons and wizards on it. It's Dungeons and Dragons. Well, it looks like something Jit would like. I'm gonna buy this for him and take it home. Brought it to me. I had no idea what it was, and cracked that box open, and I was lost in fantasy world, like forever, till now, and it continues. So it's my dad's fault. All of this, my dad's fault. Um, but I played, even though I own a lot of role playing games and books and stuff. And to be honest, I haven't actually played a whole lot of them. Most of them were just sort of reading material and fodder for my imagination, my own creativity. But I did play Dungeons and Dragons as a kid with several different groups of friends. Played a Lord of the Rings role playing game. There's a James Bond one. Another one of my friends had. Martin Muller had that one. I remember that. I think he had a Indiana Jones one too. Uh, Jamie DeMuth. We played Lord of the Rings. That was his big passion game. So played that a few times. But of course, it was all Dungeons and Dragons. As it still is today. It's the quintessential role playing game and granddaddy of the whole industry. So can't really talk about role playing without talking about that. But who would, right? So I'm going to switch views here. So I think one thing, let's see, the table I'm at here. I didn't think this through when I had this design. This is one of those neoprene mats. Should have had it just be plain black, because you look at it and go, hey, is that dirty? No, it's like a star field. And I'm zoomed in, and so maybe it's a little better now, but normally it just kind of looks spotted and dirty. But it's a star field someday. But I think one thing many, if not most, if not all of us love about role-playing games, polyhedral dice, right? Dungeons and Dragons is traditionally based upon the good old D20, 12-sided, 10-sided, 8-sided, 6 and 4-sided. I personally prefer the 4-sided dice that have the numbers at the top rather than you read sort of in the middle of the bottom. I have an example of that right here. Even though it's a little harder to read sometimes, like especially from an overhead camera angle. Sure, but okay, it's all right there. Why is my camera out of focus again? That's irritating. So much for autofocus, right? Anyway, it's the dice. We love rolling them. Now, some games use just D6s. Some games, like World of Darkness stuff, use just 10-sided dice. Dungeons and Dragons, classically, it always has, and I imagine probably always will. It's based upon the D20, and every once in a while you're rolling some of the others for like damage from your weapons and spells. But otherwise, it's all just based off of pretty much the 20-sided die. Hence, it's called the D20 system. So, I personally love rolling dice. There are some games that use a dice pool, where you collect a certain number of dice, you roll them, and add up the results, or take certain results. But the dice are an integral part to role-playing, and I love them. I've even worked for Chessex, like at Gen Con, and it's mind-boggling the volume of dice they sell. I remember seeing them at local conventions here. They'd come and set up a big old wall, tables and tables and tables of dice, and those of us there for the role-playing should be poring over which one's rolling. Is this going to be a good D20 for me? You buy a new one, new color, new something. Oh, because my fireball spell needs these cool red dice or something. But back to the games themselves rather than the tools to play them with, is Dungeons. So this is out of that red box set that my dad bought for me. I still have it. All these years later, it's so well worn and looked through. It's mostly keeping together. Um, I tend to take pretty good care of my things, but even as a kid, I read this tons. And then I remember after this, and I remember graduating to and getting the expert set, which was this sort of teal or turquoise thing. One odd thing I remember about this, which I think even struck me weird at the time, was that this was your sort of elementary Dungeons and Dragons, and to help ease players into it. But if your classes, if you're not familiar with role playing games, I'm skipping a whole lot of knowledge here for you. But especially Dungeons and Dragons, you're usually like a wizard, like an elf wizard. So you have what's usually been called a race, and you have a class, and you go up in levels. I kind of take it for granted that's familiar for most people, and for most anybody watching this, I would imagine that it is. But anyway, what was weird is you had your cleric dwarf was a class, elf was a class, so your character's race, as they were depicted, wasn't separate from their abilities. And I remember even at the time thought that was odd. As a designer now, I guess it's somewhat understandable. But these are what launched me into role playing and my love for the whole genre. Today I'm just going to talk about the fantasy role playing because I have tons of science fiction and superhero things. But I'm just going to keep it talking about the classic sort of epic fantasy, sword and sorcery sort of stuff. From there, I graduated to Edition 1, Dungeons and Dragons. You can see I've even, at some point, I was drawing each class as these little, I don't know whether I had names for them or not, type, but here's an illusionist doing a color spray of these little sort of teardrop characters, property of Jim. It's my real name isn't Layman Kingsford, it's my pen name. Some drawings back here. So these books are really well loved as well. Fortunately, hardbound, so they've survived better. They've just got my childhood doodles in them. As you can see, this is why I hire artists to do the work for my company, for my games, rather than do the illustrations myself, because, I mean, granted, I was a kid. But remember, I've got all of this first edition stuff, so many of the modules, the adventures that went with it, and auxiliary books. I've got a shelf on one of my bookshelves. It's got all my D&D sort of through the ages across it, starting with this first edition, and then what I didn't really ever have much. I think I had one source book that was technically second edition. By the time second edition was coming out, I was later in high school and then through college, and I was entirely too busy and occupied with social life and my music and music career and all that sort of stuff. So I didn't play or even buy or collect any of the second edition D&D. It sort of went past me, and I knew of it because I'd every once in a while go into like the War Games store. Ooh, this was in Albuquerque, War Games West. Wow, that's a flashback. And see that there's a second edition D&D, and I didn't really know what it was or understand it. But I remember the existence of it, and I think I have the Fiend Folio, maybe, that was technically second edition. I don't remember. I'm not, even to this day, I'm not entirely clear what all the rules differences were. But I sort of missed that one little generation. So I had so much of the first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Then, long after college, after I'd moved here to Denver, I was working for Borders Books back at the turn of the century. That sounds so old, doesn't it? Back in my day, at the turn of the century. A coworker got me involved in Dungeons and Dragons and got me to go to my first gaming convention. I was kind of scared. I knew of them. I was kind of not scared as in, I'm afraid of it's dangerous. I was not interested in the types of people I thought inhabited those conventions, and there are some types that I wanted to avoid. But I ended up going and making some amazing friends and having some amazing gaming experiences. and I ended up loving it. And it was at that time that this third edition Dungeons and Dragons was newly rolled out. I got in later in the game on that, so much so that edition 3.5 was well within this era for me. And I thought, wow, this is such a cleaner, tidier game system. Still level based, still class and race based experience, but there was so much more to it. Of course, the artwork was, I'm opening to non-artwork pages. The artwork was so much more contemporary and captivating, and ooh, these books were full color, which was a cool thing. That's not something that was able to be done in the 80s. Certainly not well, I'm sure it could be done because magazines would do it. But, and I just loved all of this stuff and was playing in the organized campaigns. Living Greyhawk, Living City at the time, and made tons of friends. And that's what eventually got me working into the notion of opening a game store, which I did. But edition 3.0 and 3.5, that was sort of like meat and potatoes Dungeons and Dragons for me. But it was also during that time I was finding, for myself personally, finding creative limitations to it. The Lord of the Rings movies were coming out at that time, so I'd be playing, there were people just trying to replicate Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli, those sorts of characters. And they were sticking to stereotypes. But I wanted to play crazier and wackier things, and depending on who's running a game, sometimes you're given leeway and freedom to be think outside of the box, as it were. But I wanted to create types of characters that didn't really fit into any of these molds, these stereotypes, the tropes of which Dungeons & Dragons is built upon. And I found myself becoming less and less satisfied. And then there's the whole math game in these role-playing systems, that it's also like you're especially the fighters and the paladins and barbarians, they get up to 7th, 8th, 10th, 12th level, or even super epic levels. You go, yeah, I've got 500 hit points. I can jump off a cliff that's 50 feet high, and I take 37 damage, but it doesn't matter. That all of a sudden was sort of breaking a lot of immersion for me, in that's just not realistic. It doesn't matter how good of a warrior you are. You jump off a cliff, you're going to die, or at most break everything in your body. So it was just some of those things that, as an adult, I found these aren't satisfying aspects to me anymore. Even though the whole notion is to play heroic characters, but I wanted characters to be able to be a little more realistic is the term I use when we're talking about fictional things. How realistic is any of it? But get to that in a minute. So after all the 3.0 and 3.5 editions, I was running big game events, introducing lots of people, especially a lot of teenagers, to the game, which was fascinating because I was working at the aforementioned Borders books, and I happened to tap into the teenage demographic of the suburbs and stuff here in Denver. They were flocking to my monthly D&D gaming events, and I remember they'd be coming, oh, we didn't know we could play this like out in public, because they didn't know about conventions and that sort of stuff. We could play this out in public and with other people, and it mind-blowing for many of them. I've made some great lifelong friends out of those kids that I helped raise into the world of geekery. And then, long after that, then eventually came the ill-omened 4th edition of Dungeons and Dragons, which played a little bit with some friends. And when it was first coming out, I thought, oh wow, this is gonna it for a lot of combat things and stuff. That was another thing I was gonna say, like especially with class-based things, especially like wizards. You cast your 2 magic missiles for the day, and you're going, well, I've got no other spell slots, and our group can't afford to rest right now because we're in the middle of the dungeon. So I've got nothing left but my little blink, blink dagger. And that was never satisfying. Well, I want my wizard to feel useful at all times, but once they've blown through their spells, then it feels really unsatisfying if you're rolled crappy for the damage. You get your 1 fireball off for the day, and it does 9 points of damage. You're going, not satisfying. But this 4th edition seemed like it was going to solve lots of things. You have per encounter, per day, and per game, per session powers, that all the characters had these sorts of things. And if I remember correctly, it was intended to, the mechanics of the game were intended to work precisely with what they were hoping to be a video game system or a computer game system of some sort. So yeah, this ended up solving a few of those problems for me personally. It was still class and level based. I don't think Dungeons and Dragons will ever be anything but. But some of the sort of balance and utilitarianism, so no character ever felt useless. But that one of the big downsides for me was every character sort of felt exactly the same. Like video game characters, just because the barbarian swings its axe and, in a big old swirling whoosh and explosion of pulsing stuff, they knock down 12 opponents all at once, and then the wizard does the exact same thing, but the graphics are different, right? Of a big fireball, maybe they do it from a distance, but the math underlying that video game is probably exactly, the code is probably almost exactly the same, other than the graphics they lay on top of it. It's mathematically doing the same damage, hitting the same number of of enemies, and that's sort of what this 4th edition did, was sort of make everything sort of bland and the same, in order to have equal statistics. So, yep, made everything, at least as I recall, seemed to feel like it made everything equally useful, but it just lacked so much of that flavor. There was so little variety. It's just words and terminology were all that made any character different. And then, of course, any of this is mitigatable. Probably not a real word, but I'm using it. You can mitigate this with your group, and juggle rules, toss out rules you don't like, create rules that you work better for you. That's one of the beauties about role-playing systems, and at least with a homebrew game, when you're just playing with your friends at home and not in the organized stuff out in the public, is you can do whatever you want. There's no limitations there. But we all, many friends, found this to be less than satisfying role-playing mechanics. And we are currently in the era of 5th edition, though I think they tried not to call it 5th edition, but we all call it 5th edition, and maybe even Wizards of the Coast does now too. I'm not entirely sure. But it's gone back to being, and that was the other thing with 4th edition, is it was strictly this tabletop miniatures game. It was all about the mechanics of moving your miniatures around, and the rules supported that, and basically only that. Again, why everything kind of felt the same. So it was much more like a strategic board game with role-playing elements layered on top of it. So they completely did away with it, and I think overall this 5th edition, for me personally, has gone back and captured, hey, be as kind of as loose as you want with the rules, but it's all about storytelling. They've got all sorts of rules and stuff on how to create the backgrounds and cultural histories of your characters and stuff, and make them at least somewhat relevant to the mechanics and math of your character. And again, as I said before, still class and level based, which is my biggest gripe, period. Not just about Dungeons and Dragons, but any RPG system that is class and level based, is that what if you want your character to have a farmer background? Well, in most of these D&D things, it didn't matter what your character's background was. They're a young adventurer that just have 0 everything except pluses in their fighting if they're a fighter, pluses in their spells if they have spells. And at least this 5th edition, I think, goes a long ways to addressing a lot of that and making it so much more flavorful. Each character can be so much more evocative of differences rather than similarities between one wizard or another wizard, that you can make them feel significantly different. And I think overall I find it to be a really satisfying system. I really enjoy the advantage-disadvantage system, where if you're advantaged on something, you're going to roll 2 20-sided dice and take the better result. So I would take that 19 over the 7. If you're disadvantaged, you'd roll them and take the lesser of the 2 results, a 17 or a 9 again on the same die. I'd have to take the 9. I think that's kind of cool. A very simple mechanic to give some flavor, to make you feel better or worse at doing certain things because of certain conditions of the game state of the story. I think overall it's really great, but I still feel shackled by the class and level system. Let me get to that now and explain what I mean by that and what I like and don't like. I think what introduced me to role, because I have tons and tons and tons of role-playing books and games, boxes. I even because I've got so many board games now, my shelves are mostly board games. I had to relegate most of my role-playing library to boxes in the garage. But I think what introduced me to the notion of something other than class and level based systems is skill based systems, which for me so much more flavorful. And Warhammer Fantasy is what I think introduced me to that whole concept. I also really enjoyed that, like, you have, I think they're called professions. This is, I think, the first iteration of it, first or maybe second, of Warhammer. But there's the classic rat catcher, but you have the artillerist or an explorer or a duelist. Yeah, as I said, the funny one is the rat catcher. You just go through the sewers. Your career has been killing rats to keep plague away. You can be, there's other stereotypical tropes of warriors and wizards and things. But you have a career which gives so much more flavor to your character, and most of the characters are just normal folk. So this wasn't about making superheroes in a fantasy setting. It was about some just normal folk that are having to go out and do adventurous things. And it's called grimdark. The Warhammer stuff it's meant to be much more brutal. Your characters are much more likely to be injured permanently, die excruciatingly, because magic is much less prevalent than like in Dungeons and Dragons. You just go, let me go get a potion or a cleric or something and get healed. And this, you're going, well, maybe you find somebody to stop the bleeding, but you're gonna be ugly for the rest of your life because you got cut across the face or you've lost half your hand. And the rules, there's stuff in that impair your character permanently and has impact on the game. I thought that was kind of cool. But what I loved is it's profession and skill-based systems. So rather than your character going up in these arbitrary levels, just getting better and better at only a narrow range of things, you can just pick the skills you want. So if you want somebody that has, like is wizard and can do some spells, well, they can also take some skills in being, in fighting with a sword. So that if and when they run out of their spells or can't use their spells or don't want to use their spells, they're still mechanically and mathematically effective in the game with a sword. Or surely they're not going to be as effective as the person who loads up on fighting skills and puts lots of dice or whatever the system asks for into those. But you can mix and match and make your character about anything. Fishing skills are actually applicable. Diplomacy isn't just a one line item like in Dungeons and Dragons, where, well, if you're talking to somebody, it doesn't matter what, it's just all diplomacy, yet there's 13, 15, 18 different skills and things that apply to different ways of fighting in combat. What if I want a character that's just really good at talking their ways out of situations, and I want to give them flavor and variation, not just, well, they have one skill, diplomacy, and I'm just going to always roll diplomacy for this, diplomacy for that, diplomacy for that. That wasn't satisfying. So I really love the notion of skills as your driving mechanism for defining your characters and then improving them. No levels, so they're just graduating and making individual skills better or gaining new skills. I like systems that don't have such monumental number creep, what I call, numbers get so big that then it starts feeling like Pokemon. I hit you with my laser eyes for 22,000 damage because you've got 500,000 hit points or something. I feel like sometimes in Dungeons and Dragons that's it. You want to feel epic, like your warriors go in, the warrior stabs the dragon a couple times in the neck. The wizard casts a big old spell, chars it, and the cleric binds it with a holding spell, and they're able to kill it rather than over 2 hours of gameplay and rolling dice and moving miniatures and finding the exact right stats. You've slowly whittled away at 219 out of its 500 hit points. That doesn't feel epic and satisfying to me. It's just an exercise in whittling away at a numbers column. So I like systems where not just, certainly combat is more streamlined. You know, what you want your heroes, your warriors to feel. If there are a bunch of goblins around them, you chop one down, chop another down, stab that one, step back, block that one. Somebody else comes in, all within one action, rather than spending 20 minutes chopping away at. I hit that goblin for 5 hit points out of its 7. I've got to hit it again. All right, and then 2 turns later, you finally get to it. You get your 10 movement feet, and it's such a slog for me. I want to feel a little more cinematic, I think. So there are role-playing systems that go really light on rules and let you just sort of talk your way through that. I feel those less than satisfying as well, because then you just feel like oftentimes they're just sort of like, roll 1 dice, you hit and kill it, yeah, all right, combat over. Well, I didn't feel like I earned it. But if you're playing a game where the narrative, the story, and the acting the character, the players are doing with their characters is the heart and crux of what you're doing, sometimes that can be just fine. That's all you need. I like something in between. I don't want to be spending hours and hours crunching numbers and rolling dice just to whittle away at the rear left hind quarter of the dragon. Nor do I want to come in and go, okay, you hit the thing once and you cast a spell once and oh look, big massive dragon dead with 2 dice rolls. That doesn't feel satisfying either. So I don't know if I'm a weird exception, kind of want something in between. Give me some sort of game dice rolling mechanics where I've got to work stuff, check out my skills, whatever I've got on the character sheet or whatever, and make the stuff happen. Make me work for it. I don't want to work too hard. I don't want it to be handed to me. So I don't know. Maybe I'm weird, like something sort of in between. So I have to say something that really, really intrigued me, and from what I can tell on the forums and the chats and the Reddits and whatnot, was when Fantasy Flight had rights to Warhammer stuff, or at least Warhammer Fantasy. They created a role-playing system for it, and now I think they've got their Genesis system, and the Star Wars role-playing game uses basically the same system. It was made with custom dice, so these symbols, you're just rolling some successes that get counteracted by failures, and then there's sort of other sort of bonus and impediment rolls to it. It was all about you roll these dice, and you sort of describe what you're doing, and do you succeed with 1 success, or if you get a whole bunch of successes, you can describe how it's maybe extra beneficial. Your spell or your attack has extra benefits. Maybe that 1 dice roll, you're attacking one dude, but you just chop that one right through, and you're able to swing on through and chop into the next guy that's within reach. Ooh, that's cool, because you got extra bonuses from the dice. I really loved this whole system because it gave you mechanics that weren't overly crunchy, terminology meaning overly involved, and lots of math and figuring, and let's reference charts. There's some players that they want to have a detailed chart for every single thing they can think of, and that's cool if that's the style you like. That's not for me, but I want to be able to have some freedom to describe rather than, if I pick this rule, I can only do the double stab, but if I pick this line item on my character, so I can do the single stab but more damage, I want to just describe, I'm attacking it, I want to describe the attack, roll some dice, sort of figure out, do I accomplish the whole concept I just described, part of the concept, or did I accomplish the entire concept plus some bonus, or did I fail at it utterly? So I want the dice to help sort of channel my descriptions, not be the end-all result of the description itself, nor be so little that only description is telling us what we're doing as the players. And I felt this system goes a really long way to doing that. And I found when I played it with friends, because the spells aren't necessarily listed quite so specifically as in like Dungeons and Dragons. A lot of them, as I recall, were a little more generalized, and it was all this card-based stuff too, which I thought was brilliant. So you did have a character sheet, but you've got these hands of cards that depict your abilities and access to powers and items and things. And I really, really liked that. So it gave you something visual to go through. Oh, I've used this one. It's got a cooldown for a bit. Oh, I can keep this one in my hand and keep using it over and over. Um, and I love the custom dice. It was a little. It would be jarring for people that are used to just number dice. It would take some acclimatization to get used to reading symbols to determine results rather than just having pure mathematical numeric results. Uh, but I love it. I think from what I read, it seems like a lot of Warhammer fantasy enthusiasts. There's a lot of hate that gets thrown on this version. Personally, it's one of my favorite role playing systems there are. I'm not a big Star Wars fan, so I've never even gotten any of those, but it uses the similar system. Uh, so that's kind of their Genesis system, I believe, uses basically the same thing, and that's the generic role playing system. I don't know if they still do it or not. I haven't kept up on that, but yay to that. So if you haven't noticed, I have um, personal interest mostly in um, non-level class-based systems. You create your character however you want, plug in an allowable number of skills and abilities. Here's some dice. Here's the dice you're going to use. Um, they're going to help you do the things you want to do, sort of dictate how well you do them or how poorly. Um, and let's go from there. So why I bring all this up is with Living Empires, and this is actually technically how I started the Living Empires stuff back in those days at the turn of the century, as I was starting to become dissatisfied with Dungeons and Dragons, the limitations of the tropes of Dungeons and Dragons. I started designing my own role playing system. I look back on it now, and woof, that was rough. But conceptually, it was embracing everything I've come to describe. It was skill based. I did skew it. It was my original concept was skewed rather heavily to like the oops, you can't see it. I've changed the scene. But to the Warhammer stuff where you're just playing normal characters, you could be the fishwife and the farmer who've gotten caught up in adventurous things. And maybe sort of you become accidental heroes, not heroes because they necessarily have epic powers. They get access to stuff that makes them feel heroic, whether it be magic items or whatever. But anyway, I did go very to that route of being very basic in terms of the characters rather than the heroic tropes, which was gaining some appeal as I did some playtesting at these conventions and things with people. There were people that wanted that sort of thing. But now that I've been in the business world, I realize that's probably a much slimmer slice of the market. So, is it something viable as a product for sale? I don't know. Probably not. Um, but is it viable as something for niche group of players to pay a few bucks for a PDF or something and cobble together their own adventures with it? Yeah, maybe. But with Living Empires, tempted to, and I've done several other role playing game systems in between then and now. And takes maybe start taking a lot of the good ideas I've had from each of these different iterations of role playing systems I've come up with, make something that's satisfying to me, hopefully satisfying to some portion of other players, but give you the players the ability to play in this whole epic big old world fantasy world I've created for Living Empires. Um, and what if we did like live streaming of our games? Which, if you asked me a few years ago, is that a thing? People who would want to sit and watch YouTube videos of other people playing their own personal D&D games? No one wants to do that. That's ridiculous. Whoops, I was wrong on that. Not only was that becoming a popular thing, but now famous people have gotten involved on it and have their own channels, which is only skyrocketing the interest in that even further. Got that one wrong. But what if we were to stream some role-playing games in my Living Empires world and then have the game system available for people to play and create their own games at home? And what if the characters you create at home and play with adventure, like official adventures, every session we do, there might be drawings from a hat or something, as to, and you submit your characters, and we draw somebody's your aforementioned fishwife from the hat, and they get a walk-on role on our next live streamed episode. So maybe there's somebody in the tavern that the main characters from our live stream interact with in some way during an episode. How cool would that be, that we all create this actual shared world, not just shared world in theory, but actually shared role-playing world, kind of like a digital, World of Warcraft MMORPG sort of thing, where your characters exist theoretically in the same world that our title characters exist in, and every once in a while there's a chance that your characters get submitted to our company, and we borrow them for a moment, for an episode or two, and they get to interact with these real characters. How cool would that be? And that the storylines, the adventures you guys play as players of it have effects that show up in the big, our title gameplay sessions. So that the chalice of power that you guys happen to research and find out about and rescue and get back to the museum, while our characters are having you show up and have to borrow it from the museum because they've got to accomplish something else in the story with that. And you go, oh, we are the ones that saved that and put that there, or how cool is that we all share it, but we don't have to play the same game together. We don't have to get together necessarily at a convention, be in the same place or at the same time. You can play the game in your own way. We'll play the game in our own way, and we can share that whole experience together and tell these stories, these collective stories together. I think that would be super cool. And I think the role-playing system I'd create now, secretly starting to tinker on it a little bit, would be something that, obviously never going to be class and level based, totally skill based, skill progression based. But I totally lost my train of thought. But anyway, I think it would have to be, I'm thinking you call it light role playing. Not so light as in, like, was it The Legacy of Dragonholt, which is very cool, so well written. I should have pulled that out to put on screen. But it's a game that's basically in a really elaborate and detailed and fleshed out sort of choose your own adventure thing. You can play it solo, play it with people. It's light role playing, but it's more interactive. Like, come to a place, and did you say positive things this, but you tell the person to will help you or will not help you. You go to page 26, or if not help you, go to page 92. So it is sort of choose your own adventure like. So that's, and you've got a character sheet, but it's basically, do you have this skill? Yes, you pass. If you don't have the skill, this other thing happens. So it's not quite, it won't be that light, but it's not also going to be super crunchy game full of charts and all sorts of stuff, but something in between, where, because I also want the game system to be accessible to new people, because that's a daunting thing about a lot of role-playing systems. Somebody might have an interest in it, and some of their gamer friends convince them, well, why don't you come and sit down and play a session of D&D with us or something, and they go, oh my God, these books, I have to know and understand all of this in order just to play, and I have to create a character. It takes how long to create a character, and what? Can mitigate some of that by handing them a pre-made character and talking them through it, and they realize, oh, it's not as complex as it seems. But it's still, there's a lot of information to ingest, and if once you dive beyond that point and want to create your own, not that the learning curve is hard, it's just the volume of information is daunting. So, by us having, publishing, as I've published the first part of Anacrusis, some of the prologue stories to the whole Living Empires thing. Check that out on the website, cheekydingo.com. Part 1, starting with Trenton Ficus, is now available, who was based upon, back in those aforementioned early 2000s, when I first went to my first conventions, I made a druid ranger character named Trenton Ficus, who was in D&D. He was a half-orc, flaming gay, of course, which made it super awkward at these conventions. Not awkward for me, awkward for other players, I don't care. It's not awkward for me. They're like, oh, your half orc isn't a big brute who's dumb. He's gay and has a thing for elf boys. Not like the Legolases. Um, and it people did it was some players you'd play with would embrace like, oh my god, that is the coolest thing. Others who were so traditional would go, I don't think I like that. I'll make sure I don't sit at your table again. But I had so much fun with that, and instead of like the druids and rangers always having like animal companion, they get a wolverine or a wolf or an eagle or a bear or something that'll do damage or can scout around. I had a fluffy pink poodle that fit under your arm named Peaches. So it's Trenton, Ficus, and Peaches. For whatever reason, I always rolled horribly for Trenton in combat. But Peaches always did really well. Did lots of damage for a fluffy pink poodle. And people go, oh, so you've got a, is it, and I use like wolf stats or something, I think. But you're just flavoring my choice like that was something I didn't, at least I don't recall running into many other players at that time who were trying to be innovative or different. Everybody was just variations on the trope. Not everybody. Many players were just playing characters that were variations on a trope, and I guess my style of play was refreshing for some people and off-putting for others. But I had fun. Anyway, so that character lives now as one of the main characters of my whole Living Empires things now. The race is trolls, not like D&D trolls, but more like hobgoblins or half orcs in D&D, sort of ish. Check it out. But so that story is available. So having these stories out there would help anybody who's read some of them before they dive into the role playing stuff understand the world a little bit and what they're getting into. So then whatever volume of rules and mechanics and world setting there is, maybe we might seem a little less daunting because they're already thematically familiar with stuff. But that's where I'm going with a lot of this is maybe we'll do that. We'll see. I don't know. Tinkering with notions and ideas right now. I certainly know a friend Arabica Grinds and All Night and Lulu All Night are interested in playing. So maybe they all do it in drag too, with as drag versions of their own characters. That would be interesting. But that gives you a little background on my experience and history with fantasy role-playing games. Some of the things I like and don't like about the various game systems, and maybe a little hint at what might be coming for Living Empires. But that's it for this episode of Game Speak. I think I've rambled enough. So whether you're drawing cards, rolling dice, or moving meeples, just keep gaming. I'm Layman Kingsford, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.